in this video, we're going to be looking at these triads we've been busy with so far. I'm going to be turning those into 4-part chords. Quite often when we're writing harmony, we write in 4 parts. We can easily write in 5 parts, 6 parts, 8 parts, whatever you want. But quite often we're thinking about 4-part chord spacings. You know, why is that? Well, you have a choir with sopranos, altos, tenors and basses. We quite often have a string quartet, 4 players, or a wind quartet. So this sort of 4-part harmony thing is often used as the kind of basis for how do we turn our triads into chords, and then how do we use them in those different formats. Then if you want to add a 5th or a 6th part, well, that's fine. And obviously if you're writing for keyboard instruments like the piano, well, it's possible to be very flexible. You might have 3 notes in one chord, 5 notes in the next chord. That's fine. If you're writing for 4 players or for 4 voices, well, you've got to be a bit more organized about it. So for now, we're going to look at these triads and we're going to turn them into 4-part chords. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might space those notes out. Okay, so let's make a start with a chord that we're now all pretty familiar with. I'm going to use chord 1 in C major. Okay, so that could be called the tonic triad, couldn't it? And we're going to work with this tonic triad of C major for a while. Now, if I want to take those notes C, E, G and turn them into a 4-part chord, well, let's see how I might go about doing that. So at the moment, we're going to stick with C as the bottom note. So I'm going to put C at the bottom of my chord. Now, if I want to turn this into 4 parts, the triad that we're looking at up here has only got 3 notes. So it will be perfectly understandable if you were saying, well, how are you going to turn 3 notes into 4 notes? Does that require the services of a magician? Absolutely not. Because what you can do if you want to turn a 3-note triad into a 4-part chord is just use one of those notes twice. So say I decide to put another C in the soprano part. So I'm using these voice terms, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. So if we're writing for a choir, we would use those. But if we're writing 4-part harmony, we often talk about it in vocal terms, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And we often write the soprano and the alto part in the treble clef, the tenor and the bass in the bass clef. Okay, so you see what I've done now? I've now used this root note C twice, and I've put it in this case at the top of the chord as well as at the bottom of the chord. Okay, so now I've got E and G to put somewhere. So I could, if I like, put E in the alto part and put G in the tenor part. So I've started with my original chord triad for chord 1, or the tonic triad. And now I've turned it into this 4-part chord. So I've got C in the bass, G in the tenor, E in the alto, C at the top. Now, you might look at that and think, well, is that okay? Because surely when we were looking at this triad, those notes come in a particular order. We've got C at the bottom, then we've got E in the middle, and we've got G at the top. That's exactly how a triad works. However, when you convert that into a chord with 4 parts, 3 parts, 10 parts, you can do anything you like with the ordering of the 3rd and the 5th of your triad. As long as you've got that C at the bottom, well, this is chord 1 in root position. You've got C at the bottom, so it's in root position. Okay, and all of these notes belong to this triad, C, E, G. Once we've got this C at the bottom, well, we can put the other notes in any order we want to. So, in other words, there are lots of different ways in which we could write this chord. For example, I could decide to stick with C in the bass. I need to do that. I could stick with that G. I could decide I'm going to have E in the soprano and C in the alto part. So what does that sound like? It sounds like this. So this chord I've just written is C and G, a middle C and E. So the first chord I wrote was this. The second one I wrote was this. So you can hear those two chords and think, well, they do sound different, but they each have these same notes. They each have C, E, and G. So if I play this chord, I can hear C, E, G. It's all in there somewhere. If I play the next chord, C, E, G, it's all still there, isn't it? But it does sound a bit different, doesn't it? Because I've slightly reorganized things. Okay, well, are there other ways in which I could organize this chord? Well, there certainly are. In fact, you'll discover there are quite a lot of possibilities for presenting the same chord. So how about I now do this? So let's have a look at what's going on there. Always check that you've got the right notes. So they've all got to be C's, E's and G's. So C, there's C again. Here's E at the top and there's G in the alto part. So this chord that I've just written sounds like this. So C, C, G, E. But all the notes are C, E, G. So all of these are different presentations of chord 1 or of the tonic chord. So we can talk about the tonic chord. And if we were going to do this lead sheet style, we'd just say it's a chord of C major, wouldn't we? Okay, so you can see what's going on with that. Lots of different possible spacings of these notes. Now, there are one or two things that we just have to be a little bit careful about when we are spacing the notes. So I'm going to talk about this for a moment, as I'm going to start introducing some of the rules of 4-part chord writing, or 4-part harmony as we know it. And some of these rules you sort of think, really? Is that a thing? Does it really matter? Well, they're rules that are not kind of absolutely set in stone, but they're certainly advisory, because hundreds of years of writing chords has taught composers that there are certain things that work better than certain other things. So if we try generally to avoid these other things, we're probably going to end up with a better result. That said, there are occasions where you think, well, I'm going to do one of these other things because I can't see any particular alternative, or actually sounds quite good, really. So I think the basic rule of thumb is if something sounds good or you're trying to create a particular effect, well, go for it. If you are trying to get your harmony in a good place in order to take a harmony exam, that's a different thing. Try to obey the rules if you can, because that's going to help your cause, isn't it? Okay, now I'm going to write the same chord and I'm going to do something a little bit different with the spacing of it. So if you look at the chord I've now written, all of these notes are still C's, E's and G's, so we're still being faithful to our original triad, aren't we? And this time I've got this chord where I've got C and E down there, and then I've got C and G up there. Now, does that sound good? Oh, yeah, sounds all right, doesn't it? But do you hear anything about that you might think, maybe I could do something slightly better with that? The issue that I'm now trying to raise is the fact that we have a big gap between the alto and the tenor part. So do you see what we've got? We've got kind of two notes that sit together in the sky. We've got two notes that sit together down here, and there's a big hole in the middle. So it's the kind of spacing of a chord that you might want to use on certain occasions. And if it runs with a kind of context, where we're kind of doing that consistently for a while, you might think, actually, yes, that would suit me very nicely. It does, however, break one of these rules. So let me explain the rule, and then we just know what the rule is. So this is the rule. I'll make a note of it here so you can see it. Don't have more than one octave between neighbouring parts. I'll explain all this in a moment. Except, there's always an exception, isn't there? Except between the tenor and the bass. Okay, so let's just consider this for a moment. So you can see that what I've got in this chord is a contravention of this, because this gap between the alto and the tenor is more than an octave. This E to that C is an octave and a sixth, so it's quite a big gap there, isn't it? Okay, well, let's see if I can reorganize this chord a little bit and see if we can cure our troubles. Well, say, I'll put an X there because of the spacing. Say I were to write exactly the same chord, but this time I'm going to take this E in the tenor up an octave. Now, let's have a look at what's actually going on here. Has the spacing improved? Well, it has, because I've still got a fifth between the soprano and the alto parts. That's okay. But now between the alto and the tenor parts, I've got a sixth. That's inside an octave, so that's okay. But here, I've got a tenth between the bass and the tenor part. Now that complies with this rule. So neighbouring parts, the soprano's a neighbour of the alto part, the alto's a neighbour of the tenor part, the tenor's a neighbour of the bass part. You see what I mean by neighbouring parts. So don't have more than an octave between neighbouring parts, except between the tenor and the bass. So much better to have this situation than the previous situation. Now let's have a little think about what that sounds like. So the chord with the X, this is the one where, you know, it doesn't sound horrible, does it? It's not sort of ghastly or anything, but you can hear that I've got these two notes up there, these two notes down here. We feel a bit separated. Now, if I organize it so the second chord I've written sounds, I've got this, this, and this. And you can hear that we've closed that gap in the middle, and it's a more satisfactory spacing. So I hope this now makes sense. So basically you can kind of take a triad, you can turn it into a chord, and what I'm trying to introduce here is the idea that you can space it entirely as you wish, but you've just got to think about this little rule in order to comply with the expectation of what we're doing most of the time with four parts. Okay, well, let's just take a different chord for a moment. So we've kind of got the idea of what we might do with these things. And what I'm going to do is a bit of magic on this for a moment. And this time I'm going to take, sorry, I just dented my treble clef. Painful stuff. Let's stay in C major, but let's take chord 4. Okay, so there is chord 4. The triad for chord 4 that you might call the subdominant. So the subdominant triad, or you could say it's a chord of F, F major. Okay, so I'm going to do exactly the same idea again, where we're going to space that chord for 4 parts. Okay, so I'm going to have the F in the bass. I could put it here, or it could be an octave below, doesn't really matter. This time I'm going to space it in a slightly different way. And let's see if you can spot the difference between this and what I was doing before. Well, all these notes again are F, A, C. So they all belong to that triad. And here's what I've put. So there's the original triad, F, A, C. Now I've spaced it in 4 parts like this. Now what you might notice this time is that this time I didn't double the bottom note of the chord. I could have done, that would have been perfectly all right. but this time I've decided to double the fifth of the chord. So instead of having two Fs, I've got two Cs. So it's okay to double other notes of the chord, and we'll come back and say a bit more about the detail of that later. But it's okay to double other notes of the chord. You don't have to just double that F at the bottom. Now, does what I've done comply with the spacing rules? Well, we've got a third there between the soprano and the alto, so that's fine. I've got a sixth here between the alto and the tenor, so that's fine. And I've got this fifth, that's fine. And anyway, it could be more than an octave, couldn't it, between the tenor and the bass. So I could, for example, decide to write the same chord like this, but have the bass an octave lower. And even though this gap is wide, that's fine because it's between the tenor and the bass. Now, it's worth saying something about, well, why are you allowed to do it between the tenor and the bass when supposedly you're not allowed to do it between the other parts? That doesn't seem fair, does it, in the world of equal opportunities for all parts? Well, there's a bit of reasoning behind it. Even though we're writing these chords as sort of two notes in the treble clef, two notes in the bass clef. So if you were playing this on a keyboard instrument, you'd probably think, well, two notes in the right hand, two notes in the left hand. That's true. In reality, quite often chords are kind of 3 plus 1. So even though you might play them 2 plus 2, the actual chord is kind of like, I've got these 3 notes up here and I've got a bass note down here. So it's often worth thinking, even though we're writing 2 plus 2, that actually in a way we're kind of writing 3 plus 1. So by putting that bass note down an octave, this chord now sounds like this. The chord before it sounded like this. Now it sounds like this. Okay, you can hear the bass notes jump down an octave, but the chord still sounds all right, even though I've got this big gap between those things. But if I did something like this, let's just take a different spacing of this chord. Say I did something like this. Okay, it's still the same thing, isn't it? It's still chord 4, F major chord, the subdominant chord. But what's going on with this? If I play the chord, you can kind of hear there's something about it that's a bit clunky, isn't there? I can hear F, A, C, so I've got all the right notes in there, that's fine. But you can see that we've got this kind of huge gap between the alto and the tenor part, haven't we? A up to C is 2 octaves plus another third. That's a very big gap, isn't it? But you can also hear something else about this chord, which kind of justifies this rule. If the lower 2 notes end up being too low and too close to each other, they sound a bit kind of thick, a bit kind of grumpy, don't they? You know, if I start kind of doing stuff down here sort of thing, can I hear all these notes properly, or is it just a kind of muddy mess down there? So when I have this chord, I'm really aware now that I've got 2 notes up in the sky, 2 notes down there. There's a big hole in the middle, but I'm also aware that these 2 notes are a bit kind of thick and grumpy, aren't they? So much better to space the chord in a different kind of way, so we close that gap between, especially between the middle 2 parts, the alto and the tenor. Now, when you look at this chord, you can see it sort of looks like a 2 plus 2 chord. When you look at this chord, it looks more like a 3 plus 1 chord. So I hope you can see what I'm saying, that when you take a triad and you put it into 4 parts, you're probably going to write 2 plus 2. But if you can think 3 plus 1, then you're allowing yourself this space between the tenor and the bass, and it's going to sound better for being 3 plus 1. You're not going to get this big hole in the middle, and you're not going to get this kind of thick, grumpy stuff going on down the bottom. So I hope that's at least introduced the idea of how do we take a triad, space it out in 4 parts, and just beginning to do business with this rule. And remember, you know, the old adage, rules are there to be broken. If you think, well, you know, that chord you just played is just what I want to use in my first symphony, great, you go for it. If it sounds good and you're happy with it, that's great. And if you're trying to create a particular effect of kind of sort of darkness and kind of grumpiness, and, you know, well, it would do the job, wouldn't it? But if you're wanting a kind of cleaner sound, more balanced sound, you might go for the first chord that I wrote or the second chord that I wrote. So again, you can see why, according to the rule, this would be okay, this would be okay, this is not okay. So I hope that's now making sense. How we get from triads to 4-part chords and how we start to think about how we're spacing the notes. Other than that, you can space things entirely as you wish, put the notes in any order that you want to, and that will just get you moving on the idea of converting triads to 4-part chords.